Everybody, welcome to another episode of JewishDrinking.com, the show. I'm Rabbi Drew, your host, and today we have Jay Rosen, who lives in Jerusalem, right?
Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv, and he is the owner of a bar named Shake It Up, and Shake as in the Sheik. First of all, how did you come up with that name?
Great to be here, first off. I love what you're doing with Jewish tradition and drinking. I started from a couple different places. One, I've always been interested in the Middle East, not just now living here, but even when I was younger, always being fascinated with the region and its diversity, its history, its rich cultures. And then subsequently moving here and realizing not only do a lot of people not necessarily know we're part of the region, we often don't talk about one another. That here in Israel, especially, we can feel almost constrained we're not part of the region, even though the vast majority of Jews from here are from Muslim countries, and certainly the rest of the region often tries to not include us in the history, if not in the present-day reality. So I try to come up with a way to talk about history, talk about culture, talk about what I also like to do, which is have a good drink, in a way that was accessible and as non-political as possible. Instead of doing something that you find all the time of, like, with all due respect to the people who've done it, like Weight Watchers for Peace or Karate for Peace, these sort of one-off, let's build coexistence by doing something social, which has great intentions, but it doesn't have any actual follow through. It doesn't have any shelf life. Here I was really trying to
There's no
create something.
lasting impact.
Exactly,
No
there's
lasting
a
impact.
lasting impact. So I was really trying to create something that had no politics. You could do in the comfort of your home. I would provide everything possible and make it as accessible as possible. The politics would be left up to the consumer or to the drinker or whoever's watching. So it started off as a blog. It then turned into a series of tastings here on my rooftop in Tel Aviv. And now trying to expand, working with local distilleries here in Israel, working with people abroad, and really trying to talk about the Middle East and its inherent role in the history of alcohol and alcohol production, even to this day, through cocktails and through the ingredients that we all share. Again, without politics, understanding that the kitchen we have here in Israel is the same as the kitchen a few kilometers away from here.
How have you found Shake It Up to help promote coexistence efforts?
So one thing I do, if any, so one thing I do on a regular basis before Shabbat comes in, I construct some cocktail made out of at least one ingredient from the Middle East. Either that's a raw ingredient, or it's an alcohol that's from here, or it's using some of the traditional flavors that we have in Middle Eastern food and infusing it either into alcohol or into a syrup, creating a drink, taking a picture on my nice rooftop, coming up with some quasi-inspirational line. But the most important part is, especially on Instagram, is taking that ingredient and then tagging it in the four major languages of the Middle East. So Arabic, Hebrew, Farsi, and Turkish. So even if you're not looking for this, you automatically find it by virtue of finding that ingredient. And I try to get one with a high number of hashtag followers. So if you're looking for, I don't know, even if it's something as basic as lemon, but even something more intense like orange blossom water, I'll tag it in the respective languages so someone who isn't even thinking about it all of a sudden sees this photo come up in their feed that happens to be tagged in Tel Aviv, Israel. And they also see it has Shabbat Shalom and it has the other languages. So there's an immediate connection, whether or not they want it, and certainly they don't have to share it because it's on their phone. They don't have to let people know they're doing it, so they can consume this also in a comfort zone that's of theirs.
Have anybody outside of Israel or any non-Jews reached out to you, whether in commenting or DMs, through some of those posts?
Absolutely. I get quite a lot whenever I do saffron. I get a lot of saffron dealers from Iran who immediately either tag me or write me or DM me. It's really funny. I get a lot of the cocktail blogs out there. They realize there's something more to it, that there's some amazing cocktail feeds out there for sure, and they make even more elaborate and more beautiful cocktails than I do. But I really try to make mine accessible, so it's more about the raw ingredients I add to it rather than how many liquors we add to it. Also because it's Israel, we don't have as much access, and because of the way the import system works, it's prohibitively expensive to have a multi-alcoholic drink. But so I'll get a lot of those people as well to see, wow, this is a great composition. I love that you thought about what you put into it. I love how fresh your ingredients are. I really try to focus a lot on, if it's going to be local, let's really talk local. Let's talk about the produce. Let's talk about the herbs and the spices that we use on a regular basis that not only are cheap because they're from here, but really exemplify what it is to live in the Middle East.
A lot of it is gearing the cocktails for people to easily produce them, produce
Yes.
the cocktail. Uh-huh.
A lot of
And
it, I try to make the ingredients as um, accessible as possible. Not that I'm necessarily going to link directly to where to buy it, but it's things that either you can recreate at home. Something that's seemingly as daunting to the novice as a simple syrup, which when I explained it's just the same amount of sugar and water. Oh, I didn't realize it's that simple. And then all you have to do is infuse the flavor in it, like you steep a tea bag in a tea. Oh, I didn't even think about that. So I'm really trying to break down a lot of those barriers that, even if you're not doing anything Middle Eastern related, cocktails have become such a craze around the world. To really understand what's going into it and really understand it from a place of its cooking. It really is cooking, of understanding the different techniques and how the different flavors balance and complement each other, or perhaps don't. And really trying to demystify it with still leaving some magic in it.
so Shake It Up, is it just the Instagram? Like, is it just a web presence, or is it also you're hosting somewhere to?
So it is offline. I have done quite a number of tastings here in Tel Aviv, both in my own rooftop as well as with some other larger events. So there's an annual whiskey competition, whiskey gala, you could call it, Whiskey Live here in Tel Aviv. And I partnered with one of the local distilleries to create a pop-up cocktail bar there, using their ingredients, which again are all made in Israel, and they're very much influenced by the terrain and the environment here. And creating some original cocktails of my own that, again, have this Middle Eastern influence to them, as well as looking to partner with other people. There is a bar in DC, for example, that is doing very similar things to what I'm doing, and it's called the Green Zone, after in Baghdad, which is the diplomatic and military area. And they're doing Middle Eastern cocktails as well, and they're doing great stuff. And one of the things I really try to focus on here is that talking about the entirety of the Middle East. It's not just one culture over another. It's not just one region. It's the whole region. And there, up until recently, it's been everyone but Jews and everything but Judaism and Jewish traditions. And most recently, they had an event where they partnered with the local Sephardic cultural affiliation where they did something for Rosh Hashanah. And I was so happy to see that. And I was so bummed. I was like a day away from being in D.C. to see that. It's like, finally, you guys closed the circle in a way that's so beautiful that you could talk about it. Even if, fine, you're still talking about Jewish tradition in a past tense as opposed to a present and future, at least you're acknowledging it. So whatever they can do, great. And in the meantime, whatever I can do here, again, to fill in those gaps without making it political, without saying you have to therefore agree to this political stance, to say, you know what, we're all using the same ingredients. And in fact, if you just go back one generation, we're really cooking and drinking the same ways.
Can you bring us up to speed? Like, what is the cocktail scene like, either specifically in Tel Aviv or more broadly in Israel? What, how has it been? How have you seen it over the last half decade or so? Has it transformed? Has it changed? Where is it at?
So exactly right, about 5 years ago when I started, it was still the traditional way of, anyone who's gone to a hotel bar in Tel Aviv or in Israel in general knows when you order off the alcohol menu, and then you order separately the mixer, and they come to your table in two separate cases. So the gin will come in a shot, and the tonic will either come in its bottle or in some other separate container. And especially if we're talking about a gin and tonic, up until recently, we're talking about a slice of lemon to go with it. All of which is to say, no, none of this is acceptable. This is not a proper gin and tonic. Number one. Number two, any American who's come to Israel knows to complain about ice, because ice is not a regular thing here. All of that's changed in the last 3 to 5 years as Israelis increasingly have more international experiences, more varied, and I would say, without being too classist, more white-collar, middle-class experiences. And they're having more cocktails in affordable places around the world: New York, Berlin, Paris, London, so forth. And they're coming back and trying to replicate it here. So now in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the cocktail scene has exploded. It's everywhere. Everywhere is trying to top up who has the most gimmicky, trendy, fad-filled cocktail possible. Some of it's really inventive. Some of it's a bit too much.
Yeah.
Um, and then only a small fraction is actually trying to incorporate local ingredients into what they're doing. A lot of it is still all over the place. And then you still have the traditional drinks. So you still have arak, which is as Middle Eastern as it gets. And for a very long time, there was this stigma that if you drank arak, you were lower class. It wasn't looked down upon. Even so, you could tell where you were from, because if you came to a bar in Tel Aviv more than 5 years ago and they offered you a shot and you said arak, they'd give you the look of, you're from Jerusalem, aren't you? You're like, oh, what does that mean? What is this? And you're like, we don't drink arak in Tel Aviv. We drink whiskey or vodka. Like, okay. But now arak is everywhere. Of course, you'll order that as the complimentary shot. You also have all the traditional arak cocktails that come out. So arak and grapefruit juice with mint, super popular. Arak with lemonade and mint, which is a classic summer drink, is everywhere now. There's bars that pretty much are only like North Tel Aviv, so the most Ashkenazi you can think of, and they're serving pitchers of this drink. It's really everywhere to be found.
That's incredible. How you mentioned earlier partnering up with the distilleries in Israel. How has the growth of whiskey production in Israel affected cocktails in Israel in the last handful of years?
So I would say the vast majority here in Tel Aviv, I can speak for sure, but the hotels and the restaurants, a lot of them are stocking the local distilleries. Right now we have basically four distilleries out there, two of which are producing whiskey. Um, that being said, of the cocktail bars, no one is serving cocktails with those alcohols. They're usually serving it as a straight up shot or on the rocks on the side. I think that's both because of the quantity that's being produced here, and it's just not as cost efficient as, let's say, getting a big case of Johnny Walker and being able to use that, or something more cost effective, as it were. So we're slowly seeing it, but it's still very incrementally. But you are seeing more and more places offering made in Israel liquor, just like you have. The wine scene has exploded over the last decade, if not more so, and we're getting even to more and more smaller wineries. And now we've gone into beer as well. We have the big beer companies. Now we have the microbrews. Now we're finally getting into the spirits.
So, two spots coming up. What
Yes.
cocktails do you have in mind for Tu B'Shvat?
Wow. So to be Shvat, I got a lot of ideas. So there's a lot of different traditions about what we eat, and therefore how we can put that into what we drink on Tu B'Shvat. One, which is I believe it's a Hasidic tradition, is that the etrog that you had from Sukkot, you incorporate somehow. So whether you candied it, whether you put it in brandy or vodka, that a lot of people do, you incorporate that in because Tu B'Shvat is all about the first little hints and gleams of spring coming through the cold and wet winter here in the land of Israel. Um, so anything that includes etrog, here in Tel Aviv, we can buy etrogim on a regular basis. There's a very famous Yemenite etrog juicer that comes from Jerusalem and now set up in Tel Aviv. He's called the Etrog Man, Uzi Eli, and he sells whole etrogim the whole year round. So you can always use that. But one of the distilleries here, I actually have it behind me in my bar, makes a gin that's infused with etrog. It's called the Forbidden Fruit Gin. With the tradition that etrog was the original forbidden fruit in Garden of Eden. And this is great. It is drinkable on its own, but it's still definitely great for mixing. It's very heavy. You feel the citrus, but it's not overpowering you. It's a great option for drinks. That's one. Another one is for anyone who's been in Israel who knows Tu B'Shvat is signified by the blossoming of the almond trees. That's like the first notion we know geographically and terrain-wise that spring is coming because it's the first tree, food-bearing tree that produces flowers. So we have all sorts of stuff that has almonds in our tradition, in Middle Eastern traditions. One of them is this stuff. You find it in a lot of North African cuisine. It's called rosetta or rosata, and it's a sugar syrup made with almonds. It is very, very almondy. Think marzipan, but liquidy. And a very classic drink from North Africa is rosetta arak, and either some orange blossom water or some always popular rose water, a few drops. I actually just mixed a little bit before I got on the air with you, so l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Um, and that's a great drink. It's really fresh. It's really refreshing. It's crisp. Even though those are two flavors that typically a lot of people, especially outside the Middle East, do not like, which is almond and the anise in arak, they work together really well and they complement each other. And of course, you water it down with a little bit of water to make it more palatable. That's a great drink. But if we want to get a little bit more creative, what I've done in the past is, so for Sukkot, for example, I made a Albata Minim cocktail. I was inspired. I was in a grocery store in the States, and I was in the Middle Eastern section, as I'm naturally always in. And they had, amidst the orange blossom water and the rose water, they had something called willow water, which apparently in Persian cuisine is a cheaper alternative to rose water. And as soon as I saw it, and I was there for the Chagim, I'm like, I know exactly what I'm making for Sukkot, and I put it all together. So I had the etrogim. I ended up making a simple syrup with the peel of the etrog. I had this willow water. So that's one, two. The sugar syrup was made with palm sugar. So two ingredients in one, the lulav and the etrog in one ingredient, the willow water. And then I just went to a natural food store, got some myrtle essential oil that you otherwise use for homeopathy, and just used the slightest of drops. I tried it with whiskey. I tried it with bourbon, with gin. You can see it on my Instagram feed. It was a beautiful drink. It still is a beautiful drink. But then I got more ambitious, and I said, okay, if we can do 4, we can do 7. So how are we going to do Shivat Aminim? So Shivat Aminim, I'm sure as your viewers know, are the 7 species that the land of Israel is supposed to be blessed with as part of the covenant. And these are meant to be things that anyways you find on a regular basis in Israel. Even though in the modern state of Israel, wheat is one of the 3 major comestibles that we still have to, and commodities that we still have to import, we can still put all of it together. So if I was to do it, and I've done it before, you got a couple options. One, if we're talking about a whiskey, especially one that has malt in it, you've already gotten 2 down, because that's wheat and barley. So we got 2. Another one, if we want to go further in terms of alcohol, we have another traditional drink from North Africa, specifically from Jews, called bucha. And bucha is a eau de vie. It's a grappa that's made from figs traditionally. And Jews in Tunisia, they call it bucha. In Morocco, it's called mahia. They would make it in their homes because, again, one of the realities of being in the Middle East is not everyone drinks alcohol, if not outright prohibited. But just like in other societies, the people who were allowed to drink it, Christians and Jews, were allowed to make it in small amounts. So they would make it in their home. There's actually, this is from Tunisia, and it's all now from France, so it's all in French on the label. There's a group out of New York, I think, making a Moroccan version. I forget, I think they're called Nahmias and Sons. Great stuff. So that's now 3. So we got the figs. Dates, we can do with Silan. Silan is, date honey is the original dvash. When we talk about Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, the original idea of when you see fresh dates growing, and especially here in Israel when it's the end of the year, and they're so ripe and they're so thick, they're juicy and they're dripping, that's what we use as date honey or Silan. So we got 4. Pomegranate molasses is another great thing. You see it now in so many places in Middle Eastern cuisine and Israeli restaurants. If you don't have whole, fresh pomegranate seeds, that's a great alternative that you can find in a lot of places. If not, pomegranate juice for sure can be found everywhere. So we got 5. So these are the challenging ones. So start with grape. So grape is a challenge because when we talk about cocktails, you don't usually find wine cocktails, but you do have this ingredient called vermouth. Vermouth is a wine that's been aromatized, meaning it's had spices added to it, as well as usually some sort of neutral liquor. Now, outside of Israel, it's very, very difficult to find kosher vermouth. Obviously, if you keep kosher, the wine has its own stringencies, and you have to follow that. There are a few places that make it. I know Kedem in the U.S. makes their own vermouth, which is tolerable. Here in Israel, you can get the classics. So Martini and Rosso make kosher vermouth in all their different forms. That's like the classic brand. It's not necessarily the highest brand, but it's definitely like a go-to standard, especially when you're making cocktails.
By
So
the way,
vermouth.
by the way, whenever I run low on where I get my vermouth from Israel, because the Kedem vermouth is terrible. But then what you just mentioned, kosher vermouth in Israel, at least you can get, which is decent.
It's decent. I would say Kedem works in a pinch. Um, I'll leave it
Okay.
at that. Be a little bit diplomatic, at least on my side here in the Middle East. But no, so vermouth is a thing. It's actually interesting. I've talked to one of the distilleries here and saying, if you want to corner the market in terms of spirits, vermouth is the last thing that no one here, even with the whole wine industry, no one is doing brandy. No one is doing vermouth. No one is doing sherry. There's only one kosher sherry in the world, and that's still back in Spain. No one is doing any of those interesting things here. And meanwhile, the vermouth and sherry scene has gone nuts in the rest of the world. So that's an interesting one. The
Yeah.
last one I would say is the most interesting is olive. So you have a couple options with olives that I played around with, and you can see it on my Instagram feed. One is bitters. So bitters come in all sorts of different flavors, and bitters are the equivalent of seasoning in cooking. You need a little bit, and they really flavor and add and enhance existing flavors in the cocktail. Whether you're thinking like salt or a little splash of this or that, they really add a difference. So if you really want to cheat like I did, there's a German company that makes olive flavor bitters, which
Ooh.
are really great. It's this, if you think of like those crinkly, almost meaty black olives that are in oil, it has that flavor. It's very meaty almost. If you want to make a dirty martini, this is what you would add to it. I played around with it to make a more subtle flavored, whether it's an old fashioned or any other things, it's a really nice flavor. But let's say you don't have that. One of the biggest trends right now in cocktails is something called fat washing. And the idea is you add fat to an alcohol, you mix it, and then you freeze it. And because the two freeze at different places, and one is not water soluble and the other is, that the oil ends up pulling out some of the impurities in the alcohol and infusing the alcohol in a much more concentrated level than otherwise you could do with just a simple infusion like you would with a sugar syrup. So you end up, and after you freeze it, of course, you can just skim it right off the top. And you're left with this alcohol that has that flavor. It's not overpowering, but you get enough of the flavor so it's there. So I played around with this with other things. So, for example, I wanted to do a localized, more like a peanut butter and jelly thing. So instead of peanut butter and jelly, what do we have in here? We have tahina, we have silan. So I made instead of putting tahina with all that gloppiness in the whiskey, and to make an old fashioned like that, I used sesame oil, like you get in an Asian grocery store. Put it a little bit, like a thin layer with some bourbon. Set it in the freezer overnight. Skimmed off the oil. Added the Ceylon as the sugar part of an old fashioned, because an old fashioned is just with some sort of whiskey, sugar, and bitters. It was an amazing drink. Actually got one of the hotels here in Tel Aviv to put it on their menu. It's a really nice drink. So I started playing with olive oil as well. And olive oil, Israeli olive oil, you can't beat it. The more local it is, the better. Olive oil has that, extra virgin olive oil has that green, peppery, vegetal flavor, which goes really well with cocktails. So I've played around with all of those together. You can come up with some, especially when you start talking about whiskey with all those different flavors and vermouth, some variation of a Manhattan, which is a really accessible drink to make. It only has a few, hard alcohol ingredients, but everything else you can pull together. It really does work. And it really got me thinking, how much more can I improvise off it? And what else can I add? Instead of being as, I don't want to sound too pretentious here to say that, oh, well, I'm just going to stick some dried fruit in the alcohol, soak it overnight, and come out with something. It'll taste great. And I definitely, for the novices out there who have yet to start making drinks at home, it's a great way to start. And I hope that once you do that, you'll realize you can actually go a few steps more and start playing around with these ingredients in a way that isn't just, steeping like tea, which is a great first start, but what other ingredients are really emblematic of the region, of the Middle East, of the land of Israel, that can tell the story in a way that isn't kitschy. It isn't, sticking a whole almond in the drink and calling it a Tu B'Shvat drink. It's thinking about what is the holiday about? What are we trying to celebrate? And how can we encapsulate that in a drink rather than thinking, again, all due respect to the people who create, like the 10 plagues shots for Pesach, and they come with all sorts of inventive ways, and they're cute and they're great. I'd like to be able to drink the drink, not just look at it and think it's a pretty drink. So it needs to have some finesse to it, I guess, is the word.
That's really cool. By the way, when it came to olives, because I think olives are the only non-fermentable of the 7 species, right?
Non-fermentable. Oh, that's a good point. Olives, I would not dare ferment.
Right. So they're the only non-fermentable.
Yeah, you can certainly get fresh olives in Israel. I don't know anyone who would ferment olives. Nor, I probably also because of how much oil is in them, it wouldn't work.
Right. So I was actually thinking just using the olive as a garnish. I really thought that's where you're going, and then you went in that really awesome direction that I had no idea about. So I was really impressed that it wasn't just putting an olive as a garnish.
Exactly. Garnish is always easy. Sticking it in the drink and letting it sit for a few minutes is always, I don't want to say easy, but it does add a flavor that you're otherwise not going to get by just opening up a bottle. But each year I try to push myself more. I have no idea what I'm doing yet for Tu B'Shvat this year. I'd love to use more bucha. It's a really nice eau de vie that you actually get the flavor. And this specific one, bucha, Bukobsa is the company. They actually make another version of it, the black label, which is more sweeter, and you really taste the fig. So this is a really nice way, and hopefully trying to partner it with something drier so it's not so cloyingly sweet. It hurts to drink.
Anything you want to promote, people should know about, cocktails, anything else going on?
I would say definitely check out, my Instagram feed. My Facebook site is unfortunately not as updated. But I really challenge your readers, especially to find out what's happening here, not just in the region, but particularly in Israel. There's really interesting stuff happening with wines, for example, of reclaiming some of the ancient grape varieties that were otherwise lost. And, there's that great legend that Chardonnay was brought by the Crusaders back to France, and Chardonnay actually means Sharei Adonai. I'll hold that there, and I like that. But we are trying to reclaim some of those ancient grape varieties. But even so, you get past that, you get into the beers, which are interesting and really trying to create local flavors in it. But then you look at the spirits, and it's just really interesting stuff. And it tells our story in a way that's so much more interesting. So, for example, Golani Distillery, which I have done some consulting with in the past, is now not only making their own whiskey, and now in their second distillery, rather, outside of Jerusalem, they're making the first rum in Israel. Their whiskey in the Golan is being made with barley that's grown in the land of Israel. So when I talked about the Shivat Aminim, they're really thinking about how do we use the terrain, because otherwise barley, like I said week before, had to be imported into Israel because there just wasn't the amount. Now they have their own field of barley. They can turn it into malted barley and then really complete that process, which is great. But even without that, we have so many other traditions from our own traditions, let alone the rest of the region, like bucha, that when I tell people about it, they're like, I had no idea that this existed. That's really worth exploring, not just because bucha, thinking a few months ahead, is also kosher for Passover inherently. And it's a nice alternative to what you're going to drink during those 7 or 8 days, depending on where you are. There's so many interesting things going on, and especially with Israeli cooking becoming so popular around the world now. It's a really nice way to complement that, but also to bring it back home and really think about what we're consuming and how it connects to our identities, not just to the land, but who we are, whether you're in North America, here in Israel, Europe, anywhere else in the world, and how we can take a piece of that isn't just the normal way of opening up something that's made in Israel that's perhaps really highly processed, but to put some meaning behind what we're creating and what we're ingesting and what we're imbibing in this case.
thank you so much. This is great. I'll direct people towards your Instagram and Facebook. And as always, l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Oh, awesome. Cool. All right. Yeah.